This is Jordan Poyer, safety for the Buffalo Bills, and you are now listening to Cover One Buffalo Podcast. Let's go.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Cover One Buffalo Podcast. You are joining your podcast tag team of Greg Thompson and Aaron Quinn. Aaron, how are we doing tonight?
Tag team champs, baby. What's happening?
That's right. I'd like to think of myself as Jimmy Superfly Snuka.
Do you? I'm more of a, let me see here, Heartbreak Kid kind of guy.
I like it. Yeah. I'm like, I had a wheelhouse there that I was like right there in that Ultimate Warrior phase of things in the early 90s.
Yeah.
And then I had some friends that kind of kept riding, and I lost track of the train there for a little bit.
You don't get me started talking about wrestling because it'll turn into a really boring podcast for everybody that's tuning in.
Good. Well, welcome everybody tonight. Jumping into a couple different things we have going on. There's a few little news items, and we're going to continue on with our positional previews going into running backs tonight and talk about a little bit how we think things are going to shake out, who we think is going to make the roster, and then what kind of production we think we're going to see. But first, just want to talk real quick about cover1.net. Make sure you're coming on over, checking us out on the app, checking us out on the website, being able to look. You've got content coming out all the time from Rob Quinn, some awesome breakdowns from Fernando, your continued draft coverage, literally jumping right back in to things, whether it's now breaking down fits from some of the draft classes or some upcoming players even from Russell and Christian, continuing to put things out there, really getting into some cool video breakdowns from Eric, just a lot of really good stuff happening out there. And just take some time to take a look at it, check out what we have going on. Give us a rating on iTunes. Give us, if you're listening on Stitcher or Pod, some Podbay, any of the other places we have going on. You can find us everywhere. We'd appreciate you taking a moment just to give us a rating and review, let people know what you think of it, and share it with some other folks. Aaron, what's your favorite part of what we have going on?
Slack channel. I love it. It's a community that has been kind of created around obviously the Bills, but it's so much more than that. We kind of talk about everything, but it's really a place where people challenge your ideas, and you can kind of challenge your own ideas and put them out there and allow people to challenge them, but in a really constructive way. It gets heated at times, and just like any place where you have passionate people that are passionate about a subject, but it's nothing like Twitter where, people are quote tweeting you and trying to make you look dumb. There really is good conversation going back and forth all the time. I'm pretty stubborn, but I definitely have conceded some things in my mind. I don't tell any of the guys in the Slack channel.
I won't. I'm not going to say that out loud.
Okay. That I've conceded some things, but I've learned a lot from people. And it's just a really good group, and I consider everybody in there a friend. And I definitely think that value in itself of just getting the access to that is worth the premium membership. And then on top of that, you get all the other benefits of being a premium member. So I think it's one of the best deals out there. I pay more than that in draft guides and training camp previews and subscriptions to stuff all over the internet. So the value is definitely there, and it's more than just the value of getting content. It's actually joining a community, which I think is a very different thing than really anybody's offering.
I agree. And one of the interesting things is we actually have a really varied group that bring different approaches. We have some folks who are really far end, analytics focused. We have some folks who, like Eric, who literally went to the scouting academy that are there for Cover One. Then we have some fans who are just from a fan standpoint and just talking about their approach to things. So we actually have a really good mix of people that bring different views, different ideas. And like you said, we do get heated sometimes at things, but it's a healthy discussion, and no one ever gets nasty or personal. It's really awesome. I agree. And it's something that I would encourage any of you guys to check out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're going to have the heated stuff whenever people are passionate. And obviously everybody knows that about Bills fans. We're super passionate. And that's why we come here, and you see it in the conversations here on the show when we're going live. You see nice, heated, passionate conversations. And if they didn't get heated and passionate, then I'd be worried that the fan base is not excited,
Yeah, no, I agree. It's I think just checking that we have a pulse still. It's no one's gone through a table or lit themselves on fire. But we check about every other Bills Mafia checkbox there. So jumping into things for the week, I know that it's something that we're trying to keep a pulse on. You're seeing some different reports out there. Sounds like maybe the defense had a little bit stronger week this week so far in OTAs. You're seeing some things. I know the offense was working on some things with the wet ball that can make things a little bit challenging. We saw some some movement back and forth. I don't know that I saw a ton of new injuries per se, but most of that laundry list that was out there was still there. Maybe a little bit of progress. We saw Mitch Morse jump into at least a red limited participation jersey. So that was a slight step forward. Saw an interview with Cole Beasley. I know John Brown was inexcused for a non-injury reason. I've seen everyone asking and no one reporting on what that is, but he was excused to be away from the team. Sure. So that at least means he's not disappearing. He checked in with the team, told them I needed to address something, just no one knows what that is. And I think that's great that, again, no leaks are coming out and he can respect his privacy. But anything that you noticed in the OTAs or anything that came up that you thought was interesting?
No, obviously, Mitch Morse coming back is great and participating in the red jersey. I think Quentin Spain was also in a red jersey, which he just came back from a surgery. And it's something we talked about in the last episode that it was probably a minor surgery, and offensive linemen aren't doing anything this time of year anyway. Yeah. So it's not like he's going to miss anything, but he can actually just jog around in a red jersey, which is what they're all doing anyway. I did hear, I think, was Zay Jones not practicing this week, which came out of nowhere. Not sure what that is. It didn't sound like any of those were serious injuries when he was pressed about it. He said none of these are Tyler Croft things, but he didn't elaborate on any of them. And then Ed Oliver, he was also in a red jersey.
Yeah, so, some kind of shoulder soreness kind of thing.
Let him say, who cares? This time of year, man, I really don't care. I don't care that John Brown's not there. I know McDermott made a point to use his coach speak and say, oh, well, obviously we want everybody practicing, getting as many reps as they can. And you got to say that. And especially you want to say that for the younger guys that haven't been in the NFL and haven't gone through the process, and not to take plays off, and every rep matters. But at the end of the day, when the cameras are off these guys, I don't think they really particularly care this time of year. Obviously it ramps up as we get into the mandatory side of things and then get into the summer. That's when it really matters. But right now, this stuff's all just kind of stuff that we get to talk about because it's filler for this time of year.
Yeah, I don't see anything terribly interesting. A couple of the pressers had a couple little tidbits there. I know we'll get into it here in a minute on, some of our former franchise icons being brought up. But, beyond that, I didn't really hear a ton that was in there. You had some of the coach speak items, that come up and go through the motions from McDermott, but nothing that I thought was really revelatory. And I think that's the whole point. He's never going to give up more than what he has to. He's going to complete his league mandated requirements. He's going to let us know what he's obligated to let us know and nothing more. If he can use a more generic term, a looser, less defined time frame, anything like that, he's going to, and he's not going to offer anything more than that.
The only things, I think maybe two things that I took out of his press conference were him talking about Kevin Johnson. The first time we really heard much about him since he got signed. I think they both, Bean and McDermott, when they make a point to talk about a guy, I think that I perk up a little bit because they really don't. They talk about the units as a whole. So when they talk about a guy, the guy has to be doing something. And like I said, it's OTAs. I'm not going to make a big deal about him getting his hand on balls now. But if that's a trend, we continue to see him talking about him making plays and getting his hands on the balls. And I think you really have to start to consider him as a guy that once camp comes around, that maybe he's getting more of the reps in that quarterback 2, or really competing for that cornerback 2 position. I think that's what they'd like. You heard Leslie Frazier talk about him a little bit last week too. So that's a theme that I'm kind of keeping an eye on, is Kevin Johnson. Obviously, when I did my way too early predictions, I didn't even have him on the team just because of bringing in Gaines, and I like Levi Wallace. I just don't know if you can really keep another guy, but that's something to keep an eye on. And then I really liked what McDermott had to say about Tremaine Edmonds and Lorenzo Alexander's leadership, and that leadership and being able to pass off some of the leadership to him, and that step moving forward for year 2. That's a big one to keep an eye on. And some of that's coach speak, but I think I thought it was a pretty interesting conversation.
I love to hear the fact that they're actually strategizing about, hey, Zoe, I know you normally lead these parts, but don't you think that'd be a good area to let Tremaine kind of step forward here? And I love the fact that it's actually a legitimate strategic discussion of, how should we approach this? What do you think we should do? Is he ready for this? And the fact that Zoe is on board with that. I love the fact that Leslie Frazier and probably Babich and McDermott are all, thinking about, hey, this guy's going to be our guy. How can we bring him along intelligently, not put too much on his plate, but make it worthwhile? All those different things. I love just hearing the fact that that's not just they're not just letting it organically happen. They're trying to be intelligent about how they do it. And it's nice to hear that they have that approach. I loved hearing the idea that, you forget the fact he was drafted at 19, played barely at 20. He's still physically developing, and they say it was noticeable how much he's filled out and started to continue to really build himself up to be ready for that, stepping forward into some of those roles. And, we might have something really special on our hands with that kind of physical stature in the setup there. And your point earlier, and again, I know you were just projecting when you first did that initial roster look for who makes the 53, but that's the kind of thing that this does, is that this isn't telling us that, Kevin Johnson's in for a Pro Bowl season, or this is now he's going to, push for, a huge starting role, but it might give us an indication that, hey, maybe he's more likely to make the roster than what we thought. Maybe we need to start thinking about, maybe it's more likely to have 5 cornerbacks on the roster. So some things like that, I think it's still a projection. We're still speculating. But like you said, they don't bring those names up by accident.
Yeah, no. And I think even if it's by accident in a way to motivate the other guys, because you're not hearing about the other guys. Obviously Gaines was on the sideline on a bike, and we know best abilities availability. And maybe that was kind of hey, you got to get out there because this other guy's coming in. It could be a motivation thing, but I think Kevin Johnson does have a legitimate shot. And that's going to be one of the battles this summer that I watch the most, is who's going to compete next to Trey and behind that. So it's going to be an interesting battle. But again, I don't know that you get a lot out of OTAs, especially when reports were that the offense wasn't playing well. The guys getting their hands on balls when the offense isn't playing well isn't a good sign really for anybody. That's what I hate about this time of year when they're playing against each other. The defense is doing well, but that means something else is going wrong on the other side of the ball, typically. So not taking too much out of it, but definitely things to keep your eye on.
Yeah. And, I know another part that came up in the press conference that, we tried to discuss, and I'm going to bring it up here, that I got really worked up about it because it bothers me when people try to apply more meaning to things than what are really there. And it was Jim Kelly. And it came up in some comments from Josh, I think initially an interview with Jim Kelly that brought it up. So then it was asked to McDermott, it was asked to Josh in the pressers, that, hey, we heard that you guys were breaking down film and going over the K-gun with Dable, Dorsey, Josh Allen, and Jim Kelly. And I think you and I both had a very reasonable response to that, in that that's nice. Okay. He's a franchise icon. The fans eat it up. And it's something that, we love to hear about the glory days in the 90s. And it was obviously the greatest stretch in franchise history. And he's the most popular and arguably the greatest player in franchise history, or certainly probably the greatest offensive player. And to do that is nice. And I think it's great to engage him. And if you can, kind of bring that along, and maybe Josh takes a little something away from one film session with him, breaking down some of those K-gun offenses, I think that's great. And it's a nice little tidbit. And I don't think it's much different than him being a counselor at the Manning Passing Academy. And hey, maybe he had a good discussion with Peyton one evening. But now people going into that saying, oh, this is awesome, we're going to run the K-gun now. Or, hey, is he the assistant quarterback coach? Or, well, who's going to be calling the plays, Jim Kelly or Brian Dable? It's just, people jump so far overboard into what this really is. And it can be just a nice thing as a nod to a franchise icon that we wanted to do something nice to make Jim feel involved. And there's a chance Josh could take something away from it. I just don't see it as anything more than that.
Yeah, first of all, I want to address, Thurman Thomas, clearly the best offensive player in the history of this team. I don't want to just want to clarify that take. No, but I agree with you. It reminds me of when, I'm pretty good at golf, and I would take my dad out golfing just to make him feel part of what I was doing. And I felt like, obviously Jim Kelly was good at football, but I feel like it was definitely a move by the team, maybe more to make Jim feel like part of the team. And it's not a bad thing to have Josh Allen be around guys that have done it in this league and talk to those guys and just sit around a couple of guys talking football. They could have been sitting there with beers in their hand. I don't care if it was sitting in front of a film session or doing with beers in their hand. But yeah, I think it got taken way out of context. People have this thing, and I get it because I love the 90s Bills. I have all 90s Bills stuff behind me. It's all around my house. I love it. I love the nostalgia, but every time something happens, we compare it to the 90s Bills. You hear we have a receiver that's shifty and everyone's like, oh, I hope he's the next Andre Reed. Or you get a running back that can catch out of the backfield. Oh my God, I hope he's Thurman Thomas. And some of that is kind of a crutch, I think. And there's a lot of pressure that comes on the players. It's one of the reasons, outside of his personal life, and I don't think he's actually a good quarterback, one of the reasons I didn't want Chad Kelly in this town was the amount of pressure that having that name brings, that he's going to be the next savior. It's a lot of the reason that I don't want Jim as an official part of this team. I know when Frank Wright was up for coaching, I love Frank Wright as a coach. I didn't want him in Buffalo because I think that pressure is too much. The fan base is a little bit overblown with what they would expect out of a 90s guy. They're heroes, they're all that, but I think at the end of the day, you got to put it to the curb and just realize that the team wants to do nice things and have Jim involved, but with the arm's length. They are not going to have Jim Kelly coming in and strategizing the offense. They're not going to go into a no-huddle offense in 2019 with Josh Allen. I think that would be asinine to even consider putting a second-year quarterback in an offense like that, where it requires such fast-paced thinking. If anything, we want to slow the game down for Josh Allen and eliminate noise. As Eric has put out a lot on Twitter. So I think the making that connection was totally out of whack. I think the media is a little bit to play in this because it was fans kind of taking and running with it, but there was members of the media that were kind of running with a narrative that I saw. I think it was the Buffalo News that put out something like, is Jim Kelly going to coach? Like, come on, guys, that is not going to happen. I love Jim Kelly. He doesn't, he's still struggling with his personal health. He doesn't have the health to become a offensive coach in the NFL. I mean, we're talking about 60 to 80 hours a week minimum. So I don't know. You have to be a little bit realistic. That's a great story for this time of year that he likes Josh Allen and he's involved, but I think it ends at that.
Yeah, and again, I don't fault guys who their job is dependent on clicks and creating content, that they know what sells. They know how to get red meat out in front of the fan base. They know what kind of reaction it's getting. Hell, we're talking about it right now.
Yeah.
So I don't fault them, but yeah, I just wish everybody would just take a half step back and just recognize it can be a nice thing without being that big of a thing. So
yeah. So we're not running the K gun.
I've been told that it is going to be exclusively the K gun, and if you run anything else besides no huddle K gun, you're basically spitting in Jim Kelly's face.
We will run it in 2-minute situations when they're down. That is when they will run the K gun, but it's not going to be all game, and Josh Allen's not going to be calling the plays. We're still going to run Brian Daboll's offense that he has worked on installing for the last year and a half, and let's just leave it at that.
Yeah. So, all right. Now, moving on into our next section here, we are going to continue down our path of the position previews. And
it's my favorite position.
Tonight, we are going to jump into what many people in the NFL think is the most important position in the NFL and matters more than anything else, which is NFL running back. And I think that we've all been kind of surprised in how we take a look at, what we did to address this roster in the offseason, in that, hey, we expected there to be an addition, in that, hey, we had LaShawn McCoy, Chris Ivory, Murphy, and that, okay, we got some guys there. We still have Keith Ford, and then all of a sudden we signed Frank Gore. I'm like, okay, that sounds great. Looks good here. And then we signed TJ Yeldon. And then we used a 3rd round pick on Devin Singletary. And then we sign a player who's led 2 different teams in special teams tackles in Centerese Perry. And it's just all of a sudden we now have 5 running backs on the roster who all have a legitimate argument or logic of how to make the roster, not including Marcus Murphy or Keith Ford, who both spent time on the active roster last year. And we have Patrick DeMarco, who still, I think, is likely to make the roster. So let's start with what you and I think is the roster side of it. Then we'll get into some of the production and the touches. I think that in the past we've gone through pretty consistently with 3 guys active on game day and a couple stretches with a 4th guy on the roster. And I'm speaking just running back.
Not fullback, right? Yeah,
fullback would make it 4 and 5. So that's been pretty consistent. So having 5 and a roster caliber running backs would be odd. Now, the only caveat to that I'll give is it is what the Patriots do, and Daboll came from there. So there is some loose connection that it's possible you could go in with LaShawn McCoy, with Frank Gore, TJ Yeldon, Devin Singletary, and Centerese Perry. But I'd say it would be a big surprise.
Well, so here's my thing, and I don't know that the NFL thinks the way I do about this. When I did my roster breakdown, I had a separate category just for special team guys that are a position, and I guess in a real bind, like you saw with Tywan Jones, and like a super bind, he got a carry or two because he has the potential, he can do the position, but there aren't those guys. And I think Perry is that guy where, yes, maybe he takes up a spot on the roster, but he really is a special teamer. I almost think that some of those guys should just be designated as special teamers. So when we have this roster breakdown conversation, I think it's unfair to say he's the fifth running back, because I don't think that there's any real scenario where they want him to touch the ball. If he's touching the ball, things have gone extremely wrong for the Bills this season. If he's carrying the ball, that means a lot of guys are on IR, guys aren't playing games. We don't want that. So I think Perry does have the chance just because of the special teams ability. It's going to be interesting to see how some of those bottom parts of the other positions shake out, because there's some good special teamers on this team this year where we didn't have that last year. So he's not a lock either, just because he's historically done it. There's going to be some good challenging there. And if guys maybe are a little bit better, say a Duke Johns or a Duke Williams, say Duke Williams is showing that he can actually produce as a wide receiver and also be in special teams, then sorry, Perry, you're more flexible to be off the roster. But I don't think it's going to be a shock if there's the four that you mentioned. Obviously, Shady, Gore, they're locks. Yeldon, his contract says he's a lock to me, unless he performs really well in preseason and there's some way to maybe move him for some late draft pick or something, because you're just kind of making room because Singletary's proven a little bit more than you thought. And so I do think they'll go with the four. Obviously, there's the rugby guy is being mentioned in the chat.
Christian Wade.
I don't really consider him, because obviously the leap that it's going to take to go from rugby to the NFL, and at his age, he also has a exemption to be on the practice squad. So I am just considering him a practice squad guy. I don't think that there's any doubt that he's going to be that guy. And that exemption, I think, only works for the Bills. Correct. I don't think another team can come in and take him. So it's just a Bills exemption.
Yeah, no one else can use him as an exemption. They get to keep a 91st guy on the roster right now before cutdowns. Perfect. And if he's on the practice squad, he gets to be an 11th guy on the practice squad. He doesn't cost them any of the 10 practice squad spots. Yeah. And it only is eliminated if they call him up to the active roster. So there's actually a benefit to keeping him as the 11th guy on the practice squad as a freebie, letting him develop, and then maybe seeing what he has for 2020.
Sure. Yeah. And that's great if he is ever something, and fine if he's not. It's zero risk.
Just fun story.
Yep, fun story. But I do get that question a lot whenever I'm talking about running backs. I don't remember to mention him, and then people are, well, what about that guy? And well, that guy is just going to be kind of hanging out at one Bills drive this year at the practice squad position. So I don't know. I think it's going to really come down to, it's something we talked about last week, is Tyree Jackson on the 53-man roster, because then maybe that makes Perry a guy that's more flexible to not be able to be on the roster, because it's going to be hard to carry 3 quarterbacks and 5 running backs. And then I agree with you. I don't think DeMarco's going anywhere. So really you're carrying 6 guys in the backfield total. And so if you're carrying 3 quarterbacks and 5 cornerbacks, like we just talked about earlier, these are the games that the GMs have to play at the end of the year. And I think it's a good problem to have because Shady and Gore are not answers for us next year. And maybe Yeldon and Singletary are. So I'm fine maybe carrying a extra guy. And I know you've mentioned it with Singletary being maybe a guy that they carry that doesn't play.
Yeah, and that's actually what I would project. If I had to call it right now, I know that TJ Yeldon was signed to a 2-year deal, which does give some future indications, but it's only $500,000 in dead cap to cut him. None of his 2020 contract is guaranteed. And right now it sounds like consistently running 4th out of the running backs, that it's, McCoy and Gore as a starter, and they're mixing in a lot of Singletary. So I think it's going to come down to Perry versus Yeldon for that fourth spot. I do think they'll carry 4 and then probably 3 active on game day, with very likely Devin Singletary inactive for a good chunk of the early part of the year, short of some injuries and things like that. Perry is a premium gunner on the coverage units. That's a guy that I have a feeling Heath Farwell had a pretty strong hand in signing. I would say that early on, he might have a leg up of his special teams coverage ability versus TJ Yeldon's receiving ability and versatility as a running back. But I will say that, Yeldon has more value into 2020 and has a chance to make the roster. I did a projection of statistics of what I think that each of the guys are going to produce that I'll show here in a moment. And in my projection, I have nothing for TJ Yeldon because I'm projecting him getting cut and that Centereese Perry ends up making it as the fourth guy, the Tywan Jones running back level. But I do think they have flexibility. Honestly, they could walk away from Frank Gore. Although I do think it's likely they want him on this roster. They want him in the locker room. He has shown that he is an ageless wonder. He is 36. It's possible they get into camp and into preseason games and realize, he might have actually finally lost a little bit of a step, and it's noticeable. He's in a position where, again, isn't going to cost us anything to get out of his contract. He's the exact same as Yeldon, $500,000 in dead cap. It's not going to be a big issue if we have to walk away from him. Devin Singletary is a 74th overall pick, is an absolute lock. And then, although it's not an absolute lock, there is a chance they could walk away from LaShawn McCoy. I think it's very unlikely, but $6 million in cap space isn't nothing. There's a chance they could do that. I think it's very unlikely. I don't see a scenario where they simply release him. I don't see a scenario where another team gives up anything of any real value to pay him the $9 million in salary or the 6.5 they would probably have to take on in salary. So I would say that it's most likely we go into the season with LaShawn McCoy, Frank Gore, Devin Singletary, one of Centereese Perry or TJ Yeldon, and Patrick DeMarco.
No, I don't think anything you said is totally crazy. And I'll use a Greg line here that it's not a non-zero chance that Shady's not on the team, but teams get desperate and do weird things sometimes. So maybe a team would get crazy and overpay to take on his contract and give us something that would be worth it. But I do think Shady, I know that he's been speculated to be gone from this team for 2.5 years now, and he hasn't moved at all. All those rumors have been shot down. I don't think that he is really on the outs. I think they brought Frank Gore in for Shady as part of ways to get him going. I think a lot of what they did on the offensive line was obviously for Josh Allen, but also to help get Shady going. I think that there's still a productive running back there, and they know that, and they takes good care of himself, and they want to see him, at least maximize his value. So I do think he's running back one still, and I agree with you. Gore's not going anywhere. I don't necessarily agree. I think his ability beyond this year, because when you get beyond this year, it's just Singletary, and he is such an unknown for me. And I've had this argument quite a bit on Twitter today when people are talking about, Singletary is the future. And I say, well, maybe, but you don't know that. We don't know that. I don't even know if we'll know that during training camp. Keith Ford played really well during training camp. He's not on this roster right now. So I think there's a lot of unknown with Singletary. He's a fun guy. He's a fun prospect. They're going to have to get him into camp and really see what he can bring. There's going to be a steep learning curve for a guy like him coming into the NFL. He's got to prove that he could be a pass catcher. He's got to prove that he could be a blocker. There's a lot of things that he's going to have to prove for me to feel comfortable that he's the only running back on the roster going into next year. There are some nice free agents. There's a big, deep running back class, but I think that Brandon Beane is going to feel a lot more comfortable if he knows he has TJ Yeldon and Singletary. So I think maybe Yeldon isn't good enough to make the roster. I don't know, but I think that his value in the future and kind of building a team for 2019 and building a team for the future kind of go hand in hand. I think that's where his value may stand out more than Perry's special teams value. Because like I said, there are some other special teams guys on this team, maybe not to the quality that he is, but where you can say, you know what, we really need to keep Yeldon because we need something to move forward with next year. And these guys are not quite Perry, but they're good enough on special teams where we feel comfortable we're not going to lose games because of them.
Yeah, and it's kind of an odd little statistical anomaly here. We signed the oldest running back in free agency in Frank Gore, and technically the youngest unrestricted free agent. TJ Yeldon was kind of like Tremaine Edmonds and came out when he was 20.
Right.
And that he just turned 25 as an unrestricted free agent after his full 4-year rookie deal with Jacksonville. So it is interesting that I think the future is there, and I'd love to see a way to keep him on the roster to be able to do that and go forward. I'm curious how big a role special teams will play. And like you said, if technically it looks like we have 5 running backs, it's not really, because Perry is purely a special teams player. He has 8 career carries in his entire NFL career. He's not actually a running back. It's just technically that's what number they give him, and he probably practices with them and sits in their position room during the week. But
in case of emergency.
Yeah, you literally break glass in case of emergency.
Yeah, and I can see a scenario where they talk themselves into that. And at the end of the rosters, they're talking about a couple cornerbacks, maybe a safety and a wide receiver, and it comes down to, hey, who's the best special teams guy? Because none of these guys we really anticipate touching the field for their position, and maybe a couple of these guys we can really sneak in on the practice squad anyway. So I think there's definitely a scenario where they talk themselves into saying, you know what, the media is going to freak out and Twitter's going to go, oh my God, they're carrying 5 running backs, but we don't care. This guy's not really a running back. He's not playing running back. He's a special teamer. And he's the best one that we're going to keep on our roster. Yeah.
And I know just one other thing with Patrick DeMarco, I drove Eric nuts a couple times trying to find a way on this particular topic. Just trying to find a way to shoehorn Tommy Sweeney or Centerese Perry or whoever or Dawson Knox.
Tyree Jackson. No.
Tyree Jackson is a fullback. Just anyone into, hey, we only run a fullback 15% of the time. Can't we teach someone else to do that and let someone else fill that role and play special teams? But realistically, Patrick DeMarco was our 3rd highest special team snap guy last year. He played on all 4 units. He is a good fullback when you need a fullback. He can catch coming out of the backfield, and he's a team captain and a locker room leader. He just checks so many Sean McDermott boxes that I find it hard to believe that he's going to get cut. His contract is finally in a position where it actually is feasible. We can walk away with only $1 million in dead cap and get his $2.15 million. We'd get 1.15 back. I do think we're maybe a little closer to this being his last year in Buffalo. But I do think he's on the roster. I think that his veteran presence matters. You still need a fullback, even if it's only 10 or 15% of the time. There are legitimate plays where you need that, and you can't just have some lumbering guy who can't get out of a 3-point stance in the backfield and make a lead block in a short yardage play. You need that role when called upon. So, I'd love to find a way to find a little more versatility. I'd love to find that in the future with a guy who has versatility of being a short yardage running back and fullback and special teams guy, or an H-back, tight end, and fullback, and that can play multiple roles and be more valuable along with special teams. But realistically, in 2019, that guy is Patrick DeMarco for the Bills.
Yeah, and that's totally fine for him to have that roster spot, because he does contribute, and it might not be in ways that show up in a stat box at the end of the game. You don't see it, but there's contributions that he's making. And I don't know who exactly sits on the leadership council that's talked about, but I'm pretty sure DeMarco is one of those guys. And any of the guys that are on the leadership council, I think they're basically as close to untouchable on this team, barring anything catastrophic. I think McDermott puts way too much emphasis on leadership, not in a bad way. I don't mean like he puts too much, like he's doing something wrong. I just think that he invests in leadership, and he's talking a lot about this growth mindset. And I think he leans on those leaders a lot to establish the growth mindset. There's a lot of young guys on this team. I just think he and Bean value that way too much to help develop the young guys. And DeMarco's the perfect guy to help bring guys along in that way. Like you said, a team captain. It's one of the reasons I didn't think LaShawn McCoy was really on the trade block last year. That guy's a team captain. They value that. I don't know if he's a guy that sits in on the leadership council or not. Like I said, I don't know who those names are, but I think whoever is on that and I think we can guess your Lorenzo Alexanders are on
Micah
there.
Hyde.
Micah Hyde's on there. Exactly. I think DeMarco's on there. And any of those guys, I think they're as close to untouchable as any of the big time rookies that we have here. Josh Allen's, Trey White's, anything like that. So there's a group of players on this team that are untouchable, and I think DeMarco falls in that.
Yeah, I agree. Looking into where we saw this, I did a little bit of a statistical projection of wanting to show.
I did not do my homework, just so you know.
And just being able to kind of show what we see as the kind of production that we think is going to happen. I actually took exactly last year's production, and I took the number of carries that we had and what was out there and simply projected what I think is going to happen this year in being able to look at this kind of setup where we made improvements. We're stepping into our second year in the same offense. We're having our second year with Josh Allen. We invested in 6 new free agent linemen and a second-round pick that was a first-round grade for most people. We should be able to see more of that. But I tried to keep it that we didn't all of a sudden become more run-heavy or anything like that. So I actually took the exact 468 carries that we had in 2018 and kept it the same and tried to figure out where I saw the amount of touches per game going, where I saw the total yards going, splitting out, and maybe a little bit of the receiving game to mix in there. So last year, the Bills ended up being actually the 9th overall running team in the league, which was surprising and obviously was heavily slanted by Josh Allen's production. I actually dialed that back quite a bit in a per game standpoint of only 37.5, but still getting 600 yards rushing from Josh Allen. I mentioned that in our quarterback preview last year, but the actual running back production, I don't have LaShawn McCoy exploding back into that kind of feature back bell cow guy, but I do have him leading the team in touches by a healthy amount and in rushing, so that I had him at 15 touches a game, 12.5 in carries, 2.5 in catches for 840 yards, which is him going from 3.1 yards a carry up to 4.2 yards a carry because of the line and the production around him, and having 1,100 total yards from scrimmage. But Frank Gore still having a pretty key role in 7 to 8 touches per game, 4.5 yards a carry, which he's consistently done his whole career, for 540 yards, only a couple catches for 600 total yards from scrimmage. And then I basically took some of the different production of the other third running backs last year. I have it as Devin Singletary, but maybe this is TJ Yeldon with Singletary being inactive, with 48 rushes for 250 yards, about 5 yards a carry, maybe breaking a long one here or there, and then a couple catches in there with, just a handful per game, 4 to 5 per game. So again, if that ends up being Yeldon, that 4 to 5 touches per game could be there. And really what this does is it puts the Bills in what I think is realistic. This would be third in the NFL this year in total rushing. 2,230 yards would be third overall without going higher in our rushes. And would not be some astronomical yards per carry. It would actually just be putting us at 10th in the NFL in yards per carry last year. So I tried to be realistic, but I do think that Daboll wants to run the ball. I think McDermott wants to control the line of scrimmage. This is about the same amount of rushes as last year, but a better efficiency because of the upgrades we made in around the roster and specifically on the offensive line.
Yeah, I think these numbers look great. I do think part of me really thinks that they are going to rush the ball more often. I think fans don't really want to hear that. And I know the analytical crowd really does not want to hear that they want to do that. But I do think that they're going to try to get the running game established early and often. And I think that's going to lead to more touches. But I think you're breaking them down, especially when it comes to McCoy and Gore. I think that that's a very realistic way to break them down. And maybe they are a little closer to each other. We'll see how it really depends on how Shady starts the year. But I could see this breakdown being fairly even. And obviously for the sake of these projections, you obviously don't know. I think you did it wrong though, because when I see Mike Clay's, he usually has like 6.3 touchdowns, 4.2 touchdowns. So I don't know that your numbers are accurate based on what I see on Twitter. But for the sake of the conversation, I appreciate that you rounded them up. No, I don't see anything wrong with those projections. I have a really hard time projecting stats for guys until it's hard in June, because I don't know what the offense is going to look like. We'll learn more about that a little bit this summer, but I really do think I have this gut feeling that they're going to kind of go against the trend of the NFL, which is more pass heavy, more passes per game, and try to take some of that burden off Josh Allen in the passing game and try to really establish the run and win with the run and defense. And I know fans don't want to hear that at all, but I think it really is actually the best formula for this team to win. And then you have that toxic differential with Josh Allen where he can make some big plays in a game. And he doesn't necessarily have to win the game for you by throwing a certain amount of times, but he has to just make a handful of big plays and not mess it up. And I think the more times you put the ball in his hand, yes, he can make more big plays, but he can also mess up some big plays. So I think you just rely on him to make a few of those big plays a game and then kind of really steady the ship with the run game and solid defense.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what they're going to be looking for. And as long as we're using that, I think that some of the analytics folks go overboard, but it's not from a completely invalid starting point.
No, it's not unfounded.
I get the idea that passing is more efficient. I get the idea that play action is valuable and you don't have to pound the rock 25 times to have valuable play action. But when you run, you want it to be efficient. We want to keep our defense fresh and available on the field, so some ball control makes sense. Taking deep shots is great, but you can't run fly patterns every single time and have receivers just run 60-yard sprints over and over and over again. So there is some strategy to how you do that, and setting up the run, using valuable play action, having a line who can actually, keep Josh Allen in one piece and allow you to take deep shots all come together in a more dangerous offense. And yes, no, I don't think we're going to turn into the greatest show on turf and all of a sudden, some high flying crazy offense, but it can be more productive without needing to, completely depend on running the ball and without completely throwing it out the window and going all analytics based and that we have to pass the ball every single play.
Yeah, that analytic stuff really only works when your quarterback is also efficient, right? So Josh Allen's not that yet. And Eric brought up a good point when the wide receivers that we brought in and people were talking about, is Beasley going to have 85 catches? And nobody's going to have that type of production in this offense. One, because they're going to try to spread the ball around, but two, because they're just not going to put the ball in the air as much as a lot of these other teams. And a lot of that is because of Josh Allen's flaws. A lot of that is protecting Josh Allen from himself. Some of that is that he's a year two quarterback that is still in the process of developing and learning the offense and being able to make all the throws. Not that he can't throw to every spot on the field, but how to make those throws and when to make those throws. So I do think that the running game will be designed, like you said, to try to be more efficient. And a lot of that is going to be to protect Josh Allen and to make it, when we are passing, more efficient use of the passing game. And it might not be to the NFL trends, but let's also be kind of serious here. And who we are as a team isn't a team that's competing for the Super Bowl. So while, yes, a lot of the top teams in the leagues, your Kansas City, your New England Patriots, a lot of these teams have heavy passing games, Rams. The Bills aren't there yet anyway, and I think it's more important to develop Josh Allen the right way, get him comfortable taking steps forward, getting this team to take steps forward, compete in more games, be in the hunt. I think all those things are more important than keeping up with the Joneses of the NFL and doing things like all the other teams are.
Yeah, and again, we're not saying that they're going to be some archaic, 1950s offense. And look at last year as an example. We started out the first half of last year literally archaic and all the way back, setting football back decades, and the fewest pass attempts in the NFL by a large amount. We ended the year 28th in pass attempts because in the second half of the year, specifically the final 6 or 7 games, we were middle of the road and the 13th or 14th team in pass attempts. That's what I see. The second half of the year, we were fairly balanced. We were not the most run heavy, not the most pass heavy, but not skewed really heavily in either direction. So I think that still wanting to establish the run, maybe we're slightly below average in the split between rush and pass, and that we run a little bit more than average. But that doesn't mean all of a sudden we're going to run the ball 40 times and pass the ball 10. We're still probably going to have a 60-40 split of 60% passing and 40% rushing. It's just not what the Steelers did of 75-25 and barely running the ball and all passing. It's going to be a mix in between there.
Yeah, and I think that that's a path to success. I think if you start getting into anything more than maybe that 60-40 or a little less than 60, I know the Patriots are less than 60-40.
Yeah,
They
they
get
were
closer
almost
to
55-45.
Yeah, I think that maybe that is better range for what they want to do here this year. And that's good because I think if you start to get over 60 with Josh Allen, I just don't think he's there yet. I know that we have a lot of excitement about who he is as a quarterback, but I think you put that much on his shoulders and that dependent to win the games, it means two things to me. Either we're trailing in every game and just trying to get back in the game if they're up over that, or they're putting too much on this kid and it's not going to end up going well for him because I just don't think he's that quarterback yet where we can really put the game in his hands all the time in the passing game. I think, yeah, he can win you some football games and he's going to win you with big plays, but I don't think you go into a game plan saying, we want Josh Allen throwing 65, 70% of this game because that's the path to victory. I just don't think that the team's built that way yet.
No, and obviously they've shown that we've increased the depth of the roster. We still have a really strong defense. We now are going to have a better special teams unit that can help protect us here or there. We're going to be in a position where we're able to win tough, close games because we have a good split. And I think Eric chiming in here with the run pass split. The second half of the year was 50.
That looks exactly perfect.
Yeah, 54-46, 54% pass, 46% run. That's exactly the kind of split that we're talking about. That we're not going to be the lowest in the NFL, but we are going to be further to that side of a little bit more run heavy than what the higher end is. And it just like you said, that makes sense because that's where we're hoping Josh Allen is in his projection and that's what we're hoping that they get to. So any final thoughts on the running back production, how you see the split going? Regardless of exactly the split, I do see a more, I guess I'll use a New England-esque running back by committee setup where I do think that we see 3 or 4 running backs producing plus a running quarterback, that I don't think we see Shady have some renaissance 1,800 total yards from scrimmage, but he can still have a good year keeping him fresh without 25 touches a game.
The fan in me really wants Shady to be hovering between 9 and 1,000 yards just to prove. There's so many haters out there of Shady, and I don't really totally understand where it comes from. I know that he always hasn't been the best guy off the field, and he's had some off the field things, but he's really actually been pretty great since he's been here. He didn't love the trade at first, then he's really embraced Buffalo. He's best friends with Josh Allen. Like they're great friends. He's really embraced the quarterback, stood up for him. Last year was a hard year, and maybe he said some things that fans don't like, but I don't understand where this hate that I see for LeSean McCoy comes. He's been the most dynamic player on the offensive side of the ball since he stepped foot in Buffalo, and he's done it with consistency. Last year was a down year for everybody across the board. Like you said, it was one of the most archaic offenses in football. Nothing was working, and the running game is dependent on other parts of the team to get going. It's a team sport. I think quarterback is dependent on the offensive line and everybody else. So it started up front. And I think if they fix that, I would really just the fan in me and the Shady fan would love to see him. I like where you had him at the 800 yards, but I would really like to see him get, a little over 900 and really start pushing towards that 1K. It'd be fun in December to see, an older LeSean McCoy kind of breaking that stigma of old running backs and showing that he still got it. Cause I think there's still some good production left in the old man.
No, I think that's spot on. And I do think that, again, I'm projecting 2,200 rushing yards for the Bills, which is top 3 last year in the NFL. So there's a chance that that's, 400 from Josh and 400 from Gore and 1,200 from Shady. I mean, that's absolutely in the range of possible outcomes here.
Sure.
I think that they like the idea of keeping each other healthy.
Yeah.
I think the coaches like the idea of those two keeping themselves healthy and being able to continue to produce and having 4 different guys, or for sure 3 different guys with different roles. Cause I think Singletary and Yeldon's role is fairly similar, just depending on who's active on game day. I think that that's a great setup for an NFL backfield and the chance to be very productive, even if it doesn't look like it from maybe a fantasy football standpoint of having one bell cow superstar. I actually think it's going to work out really nicely on game day.
Yeah, and what the problem for Shady is going to be that he always sometimes he takes a little bit of time in a game to really get going. He's that shiftier guy. He doesn't always find the hole real quick. Frank Gore is kind of the opposite of that, where he is always kind of getting going, and maybe he's not going to hit as big of runs as often, but he's going to just produce and be a safe, conservative, productive back that he's been his whole career. And I think that he can continue to produce at the yards per carry rate that he's been doing for the last 5 years. And so there's going to be some times where they're just going to feed the hot hand. And if Shady isn't quite getting going, then they're going to still have to come in and protect Josh Allen. And that's going to be feeding Gore the ball and keeping the chains moving and staying ahead of the chains. And on first down, trying to pick up 3 to 4 yards to just kind of get Josh in rhythm where they want to be calling plays and not be in third and long situations, but being second and medium, third and short situations. And Frank Gore really provides you that consistency. So that's going to be really where Shady's production shifts, is if he doesn't get going early in games. I think it's going to be really easy for this team to say, we got to feed Frank the Gore and just get the offense moving some chains.
So here's a really nerdy stat that
I love it.
I'm going to give to you for Frank Gore that I think was actually the most impressive thing I heard on Frank Gore. The last 3 years in the NFL, the player with the best percentage of the fewest carries for 3 or less yards is Frank Gore. So that's including, all the other, Ezekiel Elliott and Todd Gurley and all the other stud superstar, Le'Veon Bell, all the other superstar running backs in the NFL. And that's Frank Gore at age 33, 34, and 35. He had the fewest bad running plays in the NFL from a percentage standpoint. That's just crazy that somebody at that age can have so few negative plays or, net negative plays that hurt your offense. Because honestly, a 0 or 1 yard carry is a negative play. That didn't help you in any sense. And he avoids that all the time. And although Shady, we talked about that in a couple of the games last year, there was I specifically remember a play you and I broke down, I think in like the game winning drive for the field goal against Tennessee, where Shady juked like 6 different guys and got a first down on like a 3rd and 9 or 3rd and 10 that just nobody else on the roster could have done that. That still is in him, but he also has those frustrating plays where he probably could have got 3 or 4 yards just putting his head down, but he thought he saw an opening to the outside and bounced it out and ended up getting a negative play or a 0 on the play. And he still has a lot of that inside him too. So it's something that I love. I hope that Daboll finds a good way to balance it, finds a good way to utilize both of them to keep them motivated, to keep them engaged, and to utilize their skill set to the best way possible, and is able to get a good running game out of it.
Yeah, it's a great problem to have, but I think you hit it on the head that Daboll has a really tough balancing act to approach with this, because
Egos matter.
Egos matter and production matters. And so, maybe you can get a little bit more out of Shady on some bigger runs, but that stat you brought up about not negative runs, those things matter. When you have a coach like Sean McDermott, I think that he errs on the side of, I'd rather have 3 to 4 yards consistently than maybe hitting an 8, 9 yard, 10, 20 yard run every once in a while. So you really want to get the offensive going, and there's going to be some conservative nature to this team. And they are going to take shots and stuff, but they're trying to protect Josh Allen. And if you can protect him, I think using a guy like a Gore and getting consistent yardage, moving the ball, staying ahead of the chains, I know it sounds like coach speak, but those things matter to your Sean McDermott's and Brian Dabolls. And Sean McDermott wants to keep this defense off the field more than they did the last couple of years. The times that this defense is broken down and the games that they have broken down, it's been because they get continuously put back out on the field. And when you watch back on those drives, when you look back at the games of the previous years, it's because on first down they run and they lose 2 yards, and then second down they're in a bad position and they make a bad throw, and then it's third down and long, and this is not a team to consistently win on 3rd and long. So you're putting the defense back out. So I think he would rather meaning McDermott would rather have Daboll err on the side of conservative, continue to move the chains, keeping ahead of the chains, versus getting kind of crazy. So it's going to be tough for Daboll to balance those things, and like you said, the egos.
Yeah, again, you hit it exactly right. It's a great problem to have, but it is a little bit of a challenge. So I'm curious to see where that shakes out and how we go through. But that's going to kind of wrap up our position preview for this week. We are going to continue to work through this over the next, I think, another 5 or 6 weeks here, going through each of the position groups. We'll continue to hit on some of the overall topics, the news that are popping during the week. We had an awesome chat tonight. Had some new names in there. I know James DeSantis and Chivas, Chuck Diesel, some of you guys jumping in that have been in the show before, but really jumping in and kind of talking with us for the first time. We appreciate that. It really means a lot. John and Victor and everybody bringing in good points. You guys are what keep the show going here. If you have a moment, please jump out there, give us a review. If you're listening on iTunes, if you're talking, make sure you subscribe and hit that alert button on YouTube. Those things really matter. We all here, have real full-time jobs outside of, what we do here, and try to put as much time and effort into this. And some of those things really go a long way to help us. So if you have a minute, jump onto iTunes, jump onto Spotify, iHeartRadio, whatever you're listening through, give us a review, give us a rating, whatever system that uses to kind of give a shout out. If you know somebody that you think loves the Bills and wants to give, a minute of their time to listen to what we're talking about, tell them about what we're doing. Share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter. With a startup group like what we have here, those things really matter and go a long ways. So if you guys can take a moment to do that, it would really mean a lot and be able to kind of help us continue to bring the content that you guys enjoy and the things that I know Aaron and I love to be able to ramble about and be able to be here and talk with you guys. So, we appreciate it if anybody can take the time to do that.
Yeah, I don't like talking to you at all. So the more other people that can come on and talk to us, the better. No, I love you, Greg.
All right. Where can the people find you? Where can they find when you're sharing your love all throughout the interwebs?
Yeah, you can find me at Aaron Quinn 716, just all over Twitter, always engaging with everybody that I can. I'm probably on there way too much. I know my wife doesn't like how much I'm on Twitter. The iPhone tells you what apps you're using now and how often you're using
it's
them.
depressing.
I don't look. I looked at it for about 2 to 3 weeks, and then it just kept going up every week. I was like, I don't want my wife to see this. So, you can find me over there, and you can also find me in the premium Slack channel, always engaging whenever I can in there. I'm not on between the hours of like 11 and 6 a.m., but if you are up during that time, there's conversation going on that night. I catch up in the morning while I'm drinking my coffee at the conversations the night before, but you can catch me in there pretty much all the time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Shout out to Aaron. He had a great segment on the Locked On Bills show this week with Joe Marino for their Water Cooler Wednesday. I thought you did an awesome job with that.